record.
Okay.
Yeah, the recording has started. And let me share the screen again.
Okay. All right, then I'm
Yeah.
happy that you're recording.
Okay.
When does it start?
I don't know, in about a few minutes, I guess. Around 5 past, I guess.
Yan Chen, are you there? Yan
Yes,
Chen?
I'm here. Yes, I'm here.
We should, we should start.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Today, our speaker is Dr. Hyman Hartman. Dr. Hartman graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry from McGill University in 1957 and got his PhD degree in biochemistry at Columbia University in 1963. After that, he did his postdoc at MIT and became a research associate at UC Berkeley. He became a professor in the Department of Human Genetics at the University of Tel Aviv. 3 years later, he returned to the US and worked at Harvard Medical School, MIT, and UC Berkeley. He is now a research scientist in the Department of Biology at MIT and the director of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Biology at Berkeley, California. Dr. Hartman's research focused on the origin of life. He has published many books on this topic, including Search for the Universal Ancestor in 1987, Clay Minerals and the Origin of Life in 1986, and The Origin of Evolution of the Cell in 1992. Today, he will talk about Aristotle Embryology and the soup. This is the first talk of his 3 lunch seminar talks. Please also come in the next 2 weeks for his second and third talks. Let's welcome our speaker.
So can I start?
Yes.
Well, today I am going to talk to you about embryology. And embryology is a way to understand the origin of life. There is a major conflict in embryology between pre-formation, which means that the embryo is and the person is preformed, or it develops from something unformed gradually by self-organization. Professor Delbruck here at Caltech showed that Aristotle resolved the problem between these 2 theories. Descartes and Buffon argued that life came out of a soup and there was no preformation. The problem of the origin of life is not simply epistasis out of a soup. That is the lesson of embryology. Now, to justify this brilliant discussion, I'm going to start with the first slide. And that's me at 1 year old. The title of this seminar is called Call Me Chaim, which is life in Hebrew. And that means I'm trying to go to the origin of my life and, of course, the origin of all life. So let me go back into my embryogenesis. So from week 38 to week 9, I was just getting smaller and smaller. And in the 17th century, Leeuwenhoek and Hartsucker said, well, if you're getting smaller and smaller, you end up in the sperm, which they had discovered, and there is the little homunculus preformed. So that was the first and nicest way to look at preformation. Unfortunately, when you go back further than that into the last 8 weeks of my life as an embryo. The first weeks were called the fetal period. This is the embryonic period. And I'm gradually turning into something that does not look human. I like to for you to look at 16, which is occurring somewhere between 5 and 7 weeks. That is the the place in the embryo that I'm going to stop at now and go from this embryo into the problem, which was first proposed by Aristotle. So here is the 4-week-old human embryo. And here is it going back in time. There's 3 weeks, and then it goes back to 2 weeks. And as you could see, it's only a little disc that gradually forms a primitive streak, and then a neural grove, and then you can see the somites and the future brain, and then gradually looking at this thing that is eventually going to turn into the 4-week embryo, human embryo. And here is where that little pattern lies. It lies in this complex egg, basically, where you can see yolk sac and amnion, and that's where the little packet was forming. This is taking out the teapot, where you could see the amniotic cavity, the yolk sac, the beginning of the placenta. And then we go back in time, and you see that it's getting less and less complicated. And then you're right back to something that has just entered the womb. And here you see it just entering, and you're going back into time, and you see there's a blastocyst. There's this round ball of cells that gradually comes into this system and enters the womb. And here is what the blastocyst looks like. There's an inner, there's where the embryo is in the middle of it, in the end of it. And this now, if you go back to the blastocyst, you're going back to the fertilization of the egg. And then right there is the zygote. And the zygote has 2 nuclei, one nucleus coming from the sperm and the other nucleus coming from the egg. They join and form a single nucleus, and then they divide into 2 cells, 4 cells, and then 8 cells, and then to the blastocyst. So here is the zygote where the 2 nuclei are fusing. Here is the sperm fertilizing the egg. This is the cell, this is the egg cell with the nucleus and all the ribosomes. This is the mitochondria. These is the cell from which I came from, the fertilized one. This is the thing in the oocyte. And here you could see the whole trajectory. Here's the ovary where the oocyte came out. Here's the egg covered with a covering of proteins that prevent it from getting stuck in the fertilization into the fallopian tubes. And there's the fertilization. Day 1 is the fusion of the nucleus. Day 2 is the 2-cell stage, 4-cell stage, and then 8-cell stage, and then the blastocyst. And then by day 9, first week, it's now going into the womb. So it's worth sort of just going forward in time. Here's the oocyte. Here's what it looks like. It's a eukaryotic cell. This is the fertilization. Here is the zygote. Here is the fertilization, and then the formation of the blastocyst. The blastocyst now invades the womb. The womb now gradually creates an egg in which the embryo will now develop. And here's what the embryo looks like in the sort of egg without the chorion, which is outside. And then you go from the simple disc to this. So in some way, I'm going to stop at this point. And the reason I'm stopping at this point is because it has to do with the fact that the eukaryotic cell is where I came from. This is a picture in the most famous textbook in cell biology, which is the nucleus, the central bodies, the plastids, and the mitochondria. This is going to be one of the big heroes of my second lecture. So I've taken my beginning right down to the eukaryotic cell. And now, if you want to know more about the origin of life, where did the eukaryotic cell come from? And that'll be what I talk about in the second lecture. But now I want to go back to what this lecture is about. This is a lecture about Aristotle. Aristotle is the great philosopher around 300 and somewhat BC. He is the father of biology and embryology. And he's also the man who started logic. So he's the father of embryology. And Aristotle and the embryo. It was in embryology that his observations of the chick embryo, beginning at 3 days after laying and 5 days after fertilization, became a model system for the observational and theoretical embryology for the next 2,000 years. So he's not just a philosopher, he's also an observer. And as my favorite modern embryologist said, it was with Aristotle who really initiated the study of development. He opened eggs at different stages and argued that the development was similar to the knitting of a net. The origin of the idea of epigenesis, whether the embryo was in fact preformed from the beginning and just grew, or whether, as Aristotle proposed it, involved generating all the structures from a relatively very simple beginning, epigenesis. His studies influenced embryology till the 17th century. And just to show you that that is true, here is the outlay of the embryology of a chick. This was done by Victor Hamburger. He was the greatest classical embryologist of the 20th century. Well, not of the 20th century, but of the second half of the 20th century. And I'd like you to concentrate on stage 21. Now, here's what Aristotle and the 3 to 4 day old chick embryo, his experience. He says the generation from the egg proceeds in identical manner with all birds, but the full periods from conception to birth differs, as has been said. With the common hen, after 3 days and 3 nights, there is the first indication of the embryo, with larger birds, the interval being longer, with smaller birds, shorter. And there you see the teeth opening up a fertilized egg at day 3, and you can see the veins covering the yolk. And then by day 4, you can begin to see a embryo with these veins covering the yolk. Here's a picture of what that little embryo looks like at this particular juncture. Now, this is Aristotle. With the common hens, we've just said this. Meanwhile, the yolk comes into being with the yolk, etc. The heart appears like a speck of blood in the white of the egg. The point beats and moves as though endowed with life, and from it, two vein ducts with blood in them trend in a convoluted course. As the egg substance goes on growing towards each of the circumventant integuments, and a membrane carrying blood fibers now envelopes the yolk, leading off from the vein ducts. A little afterwards, the body is differentiated, at first very small and white. And then I'm just going to go to, of the two ducts that lead from the heart, one proceeds towards a certain other place and the other like a navel string towards the embryo. Now, nothing really happened in the embryogenesis of the chick until Hieronymus Fabricius repeated Aristotle's observations, and you could see in the 2 and 3 and 4 day what Aristotle saw. Then came after him a fellow named Malfigi, and he was the first one to use the microscope. And this is a drawing of his, of what I basically showed you on the, excuse me, in that picture that I showed you earlier. And here you see this huge net of veins and arteries covering the yolk. This now is what was seen by Pander in the 18th century and 19th century. And you see the same thing that what Aristotle saw. Now, why did I bring this up? Because I saw this happen, this use of this network of veins and arteries by Judah Folkman. I spent a year working with him, and he was dealing with the problem of cancer. And the problem that he was dealing with was trying to get or to stop veins from going into solid tumors in order to get their oxygen and their materials to grow. So his use of the extra embryonic membrane to test for angiogenesis by placing a tumor fragment on this membrane was Folkman at his best, a beautiful, simple idea. Tumor angiogenesis was tested in a simple and aesthetically pleasing manner on a fertilized egg. And here is how this thing works. A number of cells come together, they form this hemangioblast. They form blood islands, keep that in mind. This then differentiates itself into a vast vascular network, and then it grows towards the heart. So there came a huge debate in the 18th century between preformation, between Albrecht von Haller, who was the preeminent physiologist at the time, versus epigenesis, which is Christian Wolff, who was a medical student, a young guy taking on the biggest guy in town. So here is what Haller claimed. The basic tenor of Haller's theory is that all essential structures of the embryo exist first in the female egg, preformed. When the egg is fertilized, the heart is already there, begins to beat, and sends fluid through the folded parts of the embryo, which means that all this vasculature was there at time t0. And unfortunately, you can't see them because they are transparent until the fluid goes through them. So let's go back to Malpighi. All right, here is the vasculature, and this is what Haller claimed was there at the very beginning until the heart beat. And by the way, the heart was already there in place. But this is what Malpighi had found. The heart was not in place. This is the heart after 40 hours of the chick. And it's a long tube which is beginning to fold into itself and forming the the ventricle and the auricle and the veins. Here is an actual visualization of what really happens today. And you could see this tube gradually forming into the left ventricle and the right ventricle, the left auricle, and this is the center in which all these veins and arteries go out to the lung and to the body. And this is the heart, a chick heart, which results. This was seen by Malpighi. Now, what did Wolff see? Remember what I showed you. These are the islands that precede the formation of these vascularizations. These islands are called the Wolff Islands, and also Pander saw the same thing. These are the Pander Islands. Haller was obviously an incompetent observer. The heart had not been formed. The vasculature was not preformed. I mean, Wolff had won hands over a fist. Okay, so if in this great debate, Wolff should have wiped him off the map, but Haller was the greatest physiologist of his time, and everybody believed that in preformation. So therefore, that debate ended with Haller being the winner. It's one of the ironies of history. Okay, let's go back to where I was as an embryo in stage 16. And I want to show you something that is really phenomenal. This is the age 16. Now, let us for a moment compare the chick embryo 4 days after laying with a human embryo 4 weeks after implantation. Here is the embryo 4 weeks after implantation. Here is the chick embryo 4 days after implantation. Why are they so similar? And that will be another thing that will be dealt with in the second lecture. The other thing I just want to say is just to take a moment to have a little fun. You remember that Aristotle said that epistasis that he was recalling had to do with the weaving or the knitting of a net. Orpheus said that. Now, this is now in the 19th century, and Babbage had invented an analytical engine, which was the first programmed computer. And he used cards, pre-formed cards. He programmed it with cards just like we did computers before. And the guy who invented this card programming system was a fellow named Joseph Marie Jacquard. And he now wove all kinds of entities pre-programmed by these cards. And here is a picture made in 1839 that used 24,000 cards. And that is him. Now, the one who did the programming for Babbage was Ada Lovelace, who was the daughter of Byron, the poet. And here's her quote: "We may say most aptly that the analytic engine weaves algebraical patterns, just as the jacquard loam weaves flowers and leaves." So it's something to think about, that in some sense, Orpheus had thought that the weaving or knitting of a human being was the way to understand epistasis. But we'll talk about that in the last lecture, the third lecture. I want to go back to Malpighi, and I wanted to look at the upper right-hand corner, where you will see this is what he claimed he saw upon the laying of the egg. And if you look in the center of it, you'll see a little chick. Now, he was a brilliant, brilliant observer. Look at the, on the right of that photograph, you'll see what I showed you before with the embryo and the net of veins and arteries. There is his heart. And this guy was the greatest observer. So what happened? What happened is, you'll remember the picture with hamburger. That means the egg fertilized came out flat. There was nothing there. But Malpighi saw this, the little chick in the middle. Leeuwenhoek and Hartsucker had seen this in the sperm. So hands down, people then believed in preformation versus epigenesis. And so in the great combat between preformation and epigenesis, 1-0, preformation 1. But now let's go back to Aristotle and look at his understanding of preformation versus epigenesis. Epigenesis and Aristotle, it was at this mid-stage, that stage that I showed you of 4 weeks of the human and 4 days of the chick, that Aristotle, the founder of embryology, asked the following question: either all parts, as heart, lung, liver, eye, and all the rest, come into being together, preformation, or in succession, epigenesis, as is said in the verse ascribed to Orpheus. For there he says, an animal comes into being in the same way as the knitting or weaving of a net. As for simultaneous formation of the parts, our senses tell us plainly that this does not happen. Some of the parts are clearly to be seen present in the embryo, where others are not. And here's the other thing. For it's not the fact that when an animal is formed at the same moment a human being, a horse, or any other particular sort of animal is formed, because the end or completion is formed last of all. And that which is peculiar to each thing is the end of its formation. Now, I want to bring you to Max Ludwig Henning Delbruck. Was a German-American biophysicist who participated in launching the molecular biology research program in the late 1930s. He stimulated physical scientists' interest into biology, especially as to the basic research to physically explain genes, mysterious at the time. Formed in 1945 and led by Delbruck along with Salvatore Luria and Alfred Hershey, the phage group made substantial headway unraveling important aspects of genetics. The three shared the 1969 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for discoveries concerning the replication mechanism and the genetic structure of viruses. You will be well aware of that after the Second World War, Delbruck was here at Caltech and it was here until his death in 1981. So what I have to tell you was here at Caltech. So Max Delbruck now says, and he wrote a famous paper called Aristotle, Toddle. Aristotle does not consider it remarkable in a fundamental aspect of nature that human beings beget human beings and do not beget rabbits or an ear of corn. What strikes the modern reader most forcibly is his insistence that in the generation of animals, the male contributes in the semen a form principle, not a mini man. Delbruck. Anyone who is familiar with today's physics and biology and who reads Aristotle writings in these two fields must be struck by the aptness of many of his biological concepts in contrast to the tangled inconsistencies of his physical and cosmological analyses. And indeed, nobody would deny that Aristotle's physics was a catastrophe, while his biology abounds in aggressive, speculative analysis of vast observations on morphology, anatomy, systematics, and most importantly, on embryology and development. Now, why did he say this? Well, let's go to the four causes that Aristotle.
No, I disagree.
What?
Aristotle's true masterpiece is not in cosmology or biology, but in logic.
Well, that's another story.
Because not only he was the absolute, the creator and the absolute master, he has not been challenged for more than 2,000 years. Everything else, he said, you see, has been superseded, but not his logic. So I think Aristotle did three things. Number one is his logic, and number two is his biology, and number three is his cosmology.
Okay.
Oh boy.
I will deal with his logic in the third lecture.
Very good. I will wait for that, but do not miss that.
No,
Okay.
I disagree with you. I'm with Delbruck, Yuk.
Okay, let us come to the third lecture and hear from Hyman.
Yes.
Okay. So what Aristotle said, that there were four causes when you dealt with any organism or object that is designed for a function. So there's the material cause, like we're going to make a table. So you have wood, you have the design, the formal cause, you have the efficient cause, which is some carpenter, and then the final cause is to eat and drink off of it. Now, in an organism, the final cause and the formal cause are the same. That is to realize that form. And the material cause and the efficient cause are the ways to do it. So it breaks up into two ways of thinking about this system. One is from materials and efficiency by the various forces, etc., and motions, into the formal thing, which is the design, and the final thing in which its function. So now let's go to the generation of animals, which we began this with Delbruck. The male delivers semen, which is the formal and the efficient cause in biology. The female delivers menstrual blood, which is the material cause. So we just go back and look at this. The creature is produced from them, the form principle in the semen. That's in the semen. There it is. And the matter comes from the female and is produced like a bed, comes into being from the carpenter and the wood. So just as this table I showed you, he is saying that an organism comes into existence in the same way as a bed would come into existence. The semen contributes, this is Aristotle, contributes nothing to the material body of the embryo, but only communicates its program of development. The capability is that which acts and creates, while the material which receives this instruction is shaped by it. It is the undischarged residue of the menstrual fluid. The creature produced from them, the form principle in the semen and the matter coming from the female is produced like a bed comes into being from the carpenter and the wood. Material for Aristotle was fire, air, water, and earth. This is the carpenter, however, was not the form principle. And here is an interesting point. It was the fifth element, and it was called quintessence or pneuma or ether. It was a form of creative heat. His model for this was sunlight. But he also had another model for this. He gave an example of how it worked, and it was the effect of rennet on milk, which forms the curds in the formation of cheese. By the way, this model has been used over and over again in many, many countries for a model for embryogenesis, which is the formation of cheese by rennet offering on milk and forming curds. This is the first case of a gene enzyme system, because the rennet in the case of Aristotle was delivered by the pneuma or the ether. It was the creative heat in which the formation of the cheese occurred. If you want to read about it, you can read about it in Gilda's book on the history of embryology.
This creative heat is what we now know as the free energy.
Well, but it's the evolution, it's the catalysis, which breaks down a casein, and then that aggregates, and that's what forms the curd. It's an enzyme system. Okay.
I think Aristotle was he didn't give females enough credit. He was a male-centric dude.
Okay, the male, so let's now just get this straight. The male emits semen in some animals, and where he does, it does not become part of the embryo, just as no part of the carpenter enters into the wood in which he works, but the form is imparted by him to the material by means of the changes which he effects. So we have the form, which is the program, the material, earth, water, air, and fire, and the efficient cause, the carpenter, which is this creative heat, which we now see as the enzyme, basically. Delbruck. The form principle is the information which is stored in the semen. After fertilization, it is read out in a pre-programmed way. The readout alters the matter upon which it acts, but it does not alter the stored information, which is not, properly speaking, part of the finished product. In other words, if the committee in Stockholm, which has the unenviable task giving awards posthumously, I think they should consider Aristotle for the discovery of the principle implied in DNA. And as you know, DNA goes to RNA, goes to protein. DNA is the form, RNA is the messenger, and protein in the enzyme is the creative heat. The embryo was preformed, but the form was only potential, and the epigenesis was the actualization of the form in matter. The solution, this is the solution to the preformation epigenesis dilemma. That is our present day model for life, and is the model that was implicit in what Aristotle had discussed in terms of the, okay, species. Now comes the interesting question. Aristotle believed that species were immortal. Aristotle believed that the world was immortal. It had never started and it never ended. It was always the same, certainly above the moon. The motions of the planets and the motions of the sun were all circular motions which were eternal. And so that's why the material of the stuff above the moon was not the same as what happened below the moon, where the motions were basically linear and they were disturbed by sunlight. The Earth was at the center of the universe and everything headed down towards the center. So the Earth was at the center, then came water, then came air, and then came fire. Now, what about species? Because this is now going to play a big role in the next talk. Aristotle thought that all living things were composed of form and matter. The form was that of the species and not the form of the individual organism. Therefore, the individual organism was mortal, died. The species form was immortal, as the soul of the species is transmitted to the individual's progeny. And there were, according to Aristotle, among living organisms, 3 types of souls. There were the plant souls, the animal souls, and the human souls. The plant souls were based on reproduction and nutrition, growth. Animal souls were based on mobility and perception. Humans had a rational soul, which was thought and reflection. And so here is the description of the plant soul. It follows that first of all, we must treat of nutrition and reproduction, for the nutritive soul is found along with all the others and is the most primitive and widely distributed power of soul, being indeed the one in virtue all are said to have life. The acts in which it manifests itself are reproduction and the use of food reproduction. I say because that for any living thing that has reached its normal development and which is unmutilated and whose mode of generation is not spontaneous, the most natural act is the production of another like itself. An animal producing an animal, a plant, in order that as far as its nature allows, it may partake in the eternal and the divine. Now, there was another idea of Aristotle, that nature proceeds little by little from things lifeless to the animal life in such a way that it's impossible to determine the exact line of demarcation, nor on which side thereof an intermediate form should lay. Thus, next after lifeless things come to the plant, and of plants, one will differ from one another, so its amount of apparent vitality. And in a word, the whole genus of plants, while it is devoid of life as compared with an animal, is endowed with life as compared with other corporal entities. Indeed, we just remarked, there is observed in plants a continuous scale of ascent towards the animal. And here is sort of a caricature of what he had to say. This is the scala. You go from sponges to worms to insects to fishes to frogs to lizards to rodents to dogs to cats, monkeys, apes, and humans. So along this line, there is different vitality of the souls, the animal souls.
Is that Aristotle's ladder, the order? Putting sponges first is pretty profound if he was able to do it.
Well, it's an interesting question. They
were the first animals, but we know that now. But I don't know.
No. He knew that then. He had these. I mean, this is just a simplification of what he wrote down. No, the Scala Naturae became, in the 18th century, the dominant form of taxonomy. Anyways, I will discuss that in the next lecture, by the way. Delbruck went on, I would like to suggest furthermore that the reason for the lack of appreciation among scientists of Aristotle's scheme lies in our having been blinded for 300 years by the Newtonian view of the world. Delbruck was wrong. It wasn't Newton, but Descartes who accomplished that feat. Descartes, it was Descartes' embryology that started the trend towards the soup. Descartes had only two causes. He got rid of the final cause and the formal cause. He had the material cause, which was extension, which was space, which is broken up into a plenum of three types of corpuscles: small, transparent, and opaque. Motion. Light was concentrated at the center of the solar system, forming the sun. Transparent corpuscles form the vortices, and opaque corpuscles form the planets. And so light were small corpuscles, vortices were transparent corpuscles, and planets were opaque corpuscles. Light concentrated at the center of the solar system, forming the sun. It was all these vortices which gave you the solar system. And here is a picture of the vortices in a solar system. The sun is at the center, and then these planets occurred in these vortices and had vortices of their own. And light came from the sun, and this did not start that way. The deity put in these corpuscles, or rough models of these corpuscles, and that they, by motion, self-organize themselves into this system. Descartes' embryology. What Descartes wanted to do was mix two fluids. He, unlike Aristotle, believed that there were two fluids, one from the male and one from the female, and that the motions of the corpuscles in these fluids would self-organize into the embryo like the solar system did. This was the new epigenesis. Epigenesis now was proposed by Descartes. Descartes had proposed this new epigenic model based on corpuscles and emotions, and he failed to self-organize an embryo. This was a devastating failure because he wanted to get rid of the notion of formal cause and final cause. Now, it was now the turn of Buffon and Maupertuis, who were inspired by Newton and his solar system to take up epigenesis of the corpuscles, but they added a new idea, which was the introduction of attractive forces modeled on Newtonian gravity. They turned to crystals for inspiration. And I'm now going to end this talk with the Buffon and the soup. By examining, this is Buffon's idea. By examining this idea thoroughly, we shall discover a connection between animals, vegetables, and minerals, which we could not expect. Salts and some other minerals are composed of parts resembling each other, and to all that composes them. A grain of salt is a cube composed of an infinity of smaller cubes, which we may easily perceive by a microscope. These are also composed of other cubes, still smaller, as may be perceived with a better microscope. And we cannot doubt but that the primitive and constituting particles of this salt are likewise cubes so exceedingly minute as to escape our sight and our imagination. Animals and plants which can multiply by their parts are organized bodies of which the primitive and constituting parts are also organic and similar, of which we discern the aggregate quantity but cannot perceive the primitive parts, except by reason and analogy. And these parts he called organic molecules. Howie was a very famous fellow at the Garden of the Plants, which was founded by Buffon. And he invented the integrant particle, modeling himself somewhat on Buffon's idea. And here is his model of crystals. And what he modeled the crystal was on the unit cell. And here you can see he's modeling pyrite. So Buffon and the organic molecule was trying to do the same. Just as there is, we've recognized an infinity of similar inert particles of innate bodies, and as it would perhaps be necessary for millions of small cubes of salt to accumulate in order to make the visible individual cube of sea salt, so likewise millions of organic molecules like the whole are likely to form a single one out of the multiplicity of germs contained in an elm or a polyp. And as we separate, bruise, and dissolve a cube of sea salt to perceive by means of crystallization the small cubes of which it is composed, we must likewise separate the parts of an elm or a polypus to discover by means of vegetation and expansion the small elms and polyps of those size. The experiment, this is the experiment. In 1745, Needham and Buffon began to experiment with soups, mutton soup, chicken soup, vegetable soup, which were filled with organic molecules. They boiled the soup in glass flasks and stoppered them with corks and waited for a few days. They then opened the flasks and they were filled with swimming bacteria. The soup was born. Spallanzani, who belonged to the group of people that were preformists, said this is nonsense. He said putting in corks and stuff like that, that's nonsense. So he took the flask and he closed the flask by heating the top part of the flask so it was sealed, and then boiling the stuff. And he did it with all these soups, and there was never a sign of any growth unless the flasks were subsequently opened to the air. This suggested that microbes were introduced into these flasks from the air. And then began the battle of the flasks. And because when they opened the flask, air rushed in. And so what Needham and Buffon claimed was, oh, you by sealing it and then heating it were destroying something in the air. Well, we all know what happened. In the 19th century, Louis Pasteur did the same thing with the swan neck of the at the top of the flask. And as long as that swan neck was intact, no growth. When you broke the thing and opened it to the air, growth occurred. So the soup was dead. But stay tuned, it did not die, but it is the dominant theory for the origin of life today. Okay, so I'm now just going to summarize what I just told you. Embryology is a way to understand the origin of life. The major conflict has been between preformation or epigenesis. Delbruck showed that Aristotle resolved the problem between these two theories because preformation was the program and then reading out that program was epigenesis. Descartes and Buffon argued that life came out of a soup. There was no preformation. It was a crystallization. It was a self-organization. The problem of the origin of life is not simply epistasis out of a soup. That is the answer of embryology. And so I'm done. End of presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hartman.
I think I'm not over, I didn't speak over.
You are exactly on time. You are exactly on this 1.00. Fantastic, fantastic.
Well,
Yeah, does anyone have a question? We have time for questions.
Yeah, I have a question. I remember when Newton was proposing his famous theory of universal gravitation, there was a challenger, and the challenger was Descartes.
yes, of course.
And Descartes has this theory of vortices. And the reason was very interesting. Descartes, being a philosopher, was philosophically opposed to Newton's gravitation because it's Newton's law, you see, implies action at a distance, which of course bothered Einstein a few hundred years later. You see,
Actually,
Descartes,
yes.
Descartes being a very profound thinker, for that is unacceptable, that you can have action at a distance. And so he advanced this theory of the vortices, which you mentioned. But eventually, of course, we know this vortices theory was a failure. And Newton was right, but Newton did not go back to the cause. I mean, Newton took this empirical approach that this empirical law of universal gravitation works, and then leaving the origin, you see, the origin of that gravitational force to Einstein.
Well, I was just reading a paper the other night. I think this is in the Reviews of Modern Physics, but someone claimed that Descartes was much closer to Einstein, and Einstein did because he did not believe in empty space.
Yeah.
His space was very active. It was a fluid.
Yes.
And according to Newton, space was absolute and was completely passive. So it is true that Descartes may have been much closer to Einstein than Newton was.
But he was several hundred years ahead, ahead of his time. But his philosophy, he was a better. I think he's a better philosopher than a physicist.
Well, let's put it this way. it's a difference between ordinary differential equations and partial differential equations. Given the mathematics of the time, you may know that Newton spent approximately a third of the Principia pointing out that the vortices did not work.
Yes,
So,
yes.
so the point is that this shows you if you're too far ahead of your time with tools that you don't have, you're not much worth. You're not worth anything. I mean, ultimately, the vortex theory it never went anywhere.
Yeah, that is correct.
I would like to
Speak up
talk
because
about, I'd like to talk a little bit about Aristotle. He was a good observer of chick embryos, I think, or from what you say, but he was a bad observer of a lot of other things, especially in physics.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
He, and I'd say to Yuk that he used logic without observation to make a lot of what we now realize are nonsensical statements. And I don't think, I think it's a big mistake to use logic to prove theories about the physical world. You need observations, and Aristotle sometimes disregarded that fact.
Well, let me say a couple of things about that. There is a group of people. Delbruck just said what you just said. If you look at his stuff on physics or cosmology, they're nonsense. And that's fine. And I would agree. I mean, obviously that the physics above the moon is the same as the physics below the moon. You know, that idea that there's a different physics above the moon from below the moon. But there is a group of people, which is very interesting, said the way to look at his physics and his biology is in terms of thermodynamics and not mechanics. And the guy who did that was this guy Duhem, who is known for the Gibbs-Duhem equation. And he wrote a whole thing about how the right way to go is Aristotle, because he dealt with irreversible phenomena. And it's an I'll show it to you sometime. It's an interesting point of view. And the reason that it's an interesting point of view was that at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, until Einstein, there was a big debate between the people in thermodynamics versus the people in mechanics. And the people in thermodynamics said, we don't believe in atoms. There's no reason to believe in atoms. And they spent, I mean, and Planck, by the way, was one of them. He was a very fierce enemy of Boltzmann. And it was only when he came to trying to do the black body radiation that he adopted Boltzmann, and that's what gave him quantum mechanics. So it's an interesting story about, so you can look at Aristotle as sort of Planck, and he was against atomism. He destroyed atomism. So it's a nice corollary. You have Aristotle and atomism, and you have Planck and Boltzmann. And it was only with Einstein's, 1905 paper and random walks that finally convinced everybody that there were atoms. Anyways, it's just a little sidelight, but you're right in a sense that there's a lot in Aristotle. I'm not claiming that Aristotle was right on everything, but on embryology, he is right on. It's not me. I mean, someone who is more physically oriented than I am, Delbrook, you ought to read this paper of Aristotle, Toddle. I'll send it to you.
Send it to me and I will send it to this group.
Okay, I'll be happy to do that.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think time is up. Unless someone has any urgent question for Hyman.
No, it's a terrific talk. Terrific.
Anyways,
Yeah.
Thank you for allowing me
Thank you.
to discuss. This is a very hard talk to give because I'm trying to deal with concepts that are not available. That is, when you're talking about Aristotle and his observations and stuff like that, and his notion of formal and soul and stuff like that, it's hard to make that understandable in modern terms.
Yeah.
Very good.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hartman. And we will meet next Wednesday. Let's thank our speaker again. Okay, Dr. Hartman, please hold on. I'm coming to your office to pause the
I'm
recording.
putting on my mask.
Okay, bye.
Hello,
Bye.
Burl. How did it go?
Fantastic. So looking forward to your next week's lecture. Okay, bye.
Okay.
Bibby,
Yeah.
you were great. It was terrific. It was really great. Well done.
Okay. How was my tone?
The tone was perfect. And you managed to condense a lot of the wordy slides into their main points. And I thought it was great.
Okay, Burl, I'm signing off because it's not my computer.
Me too. Yeah, okay. I'm signing off too. Shall I